So what are the take-home messages from all of this clinical trial data, the 68 clinical trials that have been carried out so far looking at cannabis-based medicines in pain disorders? So firstly, I'll say that it's a bit of a mixed bag. These trials are looking at lots of different types of products, also lots of different types of formulations. So sometimes tablets, sometimes capsules, sometimes oils, sometimes solutions, sometimes tea, sometimes inhaled, and lots of different routes of delivery. So it can be very difficult to say exactly which products are beneficial in different pain disorders. We have quite a lot of these phase 2 proof of concept trials. So a lot of positive trials in various pain conditions showing us that there is a signal that cannabis-based medicines can be effective in managing pain, but just not enough phase 3 clinical trials. And the most of the phase 3 clinical trials that we have are with Sativex, the one-to-one compound that was developed by GW. So we have the best evidence with Sativex. That's not to say that Sativex is necessarily the best product to be used. We don't know which is the best product, but it's just the product that we have the best evidence for because we have the most clinical trial data in the most number of patients. Something that isn't really done in most of these studies is actually doing any kind of head-to-head comparison of different types of cannabis-based medicinal products in different types of pain disorders. So it may be with more research that we find out CBD products are quite good in inflammatory pain, but THC products are good in neuropathic pain. But we're not really at that level of granularity in understanding cannabis-based medicines in pain. In my opinion, pain ratings are probably not the best primary endpoint to be judging the effectiveness of a cannabis-based medicine and the success of a trial being dependent on changes in those pain ratings. There are other ways that we could be measuring success. And something that we know is definitely improved by cannabis-based medicines are quality of life endpoints. So mental health, sleep, range of motion, ability to socialize and daily function. These are the kind of things that we know are improved by cannabis-based medicines. A lot of chronic pain patients would say that the side effect profile of cannabis-based medicines are a lot more favorable than their current standard care, so their opioids or their other medicines that they're on. They would say that the side effect profile of those medicines is far worse. So you may not get better pain management with cannabis, but you certainly don't get all the additional side effects from the painkillers. Something we don't have any information on is health economic data, and that's something that's going to be very persuasive to regulators and to governments about really broadening access to cannabis-based medicines. If we can show that it is more economic to give people with lifelong chronic pain conditions a cannabis-based medicine compared to some other medications and the impact they might have. So it's something that we really have no data on and needs to be researched. So in my opinion, I think we need better clinical trial design in pain in order to be able to prove the effectiveness of cannabis-based products. So I look at the data that we have, those 68 trials, I look at it quite positively. I think that there's quite good evidence to suggest that cannabis-based medicines are effective, but that's my opinion. And actually, if you look at systematic reviews that are out there or narrative reviews that are out there, there are a lot of people who look at the same data and think that actually cannabis-based medicines aren't very effective, and that actually the numbers needed to treat is too high, and that we shouldn't be using them. So it kind of depends. I'm probably biased, but it does depend on how you look at the data. So we need better data to really persuade people that this is an effective way of managing chronic pain. So what about the scientific literature that's behind all this? So we have quite a lot of clinical data, but we also have a really good wealth of preclinical data to support the concept that cannabis-based medicines and cannabinoids are very good analgesics. We really understand how they work, and there's been an awful lot of research that's been done on this since the chemicals were discovered in the 60s, and then when our cannabinoid receptors that these compounds specifically bind to were identified in the 90s. So since then there's been a huge amount of research that's proven scientifically how these compounds work in the body. And there's an awful lot of references here that you can go and follow up on if you want to read more about this topic. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview about how we know the different compounds work. So firstly, THC, because THC really is the primary analgesic in cannabis. It is the main compound by which we think the analgesic effects are being brought about. So we know that the main mechanism of action of THC through animal studies involves activation of the CB1 receptor. And CB1 receptors are expressed all over our central nervous system, including in all of the nerves that transmit pain. And they cause inhibition of the transmission of pain signals. So we know that that's how THC works, and could be why the THC is so effective in neuropathic pain. There are other mechanisms of action, so it's not just the CB1 receptor. THC does act at other receptors in the body and ion channels, and one of the other main ways through which THC brings about analgesia is through activation of ion channels called TRPs, and these are transient receptor potential ion channels, and they are so the TRPV1 receptor, it used to be called the vanilloid receptor. It's the receptor that is activated by capsaicin, which is the what makes chilies hot. So you can have desensitization of these receptors, which means then you don't feel any pain, which is how THC, or part of the mechanism by which THC acts. There can also be a role for CB2 receptor. CB2 is best known for its role in inflammation. So it's particularly in inflammatory pain disorders where there is also a contribution of CB2 activation by THC. And THC also enhances the function of glycine receptors, which are another way of modulating or perceiving pain. And so THC can dampen the perception of pain through glycine receptors. And something I'm going to come back to is also that there is an interaction between cannabinoid receptors, so particularly the CB1 receptor and opioid receptors, in that they synergize with each other and they enhance each other's pain relieving effects. So that means that THC could enhance the effect of an opioid if you are taking an opioid, or it could be enhancing the natural analgesic effects of endorphins in our own brain, so the natural compounds that activate opioid receptors. So what's important to note here is not particularly the science and all of the different receptors that we know THC acts by, but the fact that there's very hard science behind this. We really understand how THC works, and it's by multiple mechanisms. So sometimes some medicines only act by one mechanism. So there is a particular receptor that they either activate or inhibit. But THC has a really interesting pharmacology in that it acts at lots of different receptors. And so it brings about analgesia through several ways, at least 5 ways here I'm mentioning that THC can bring about analgesia. So it just means that it's really quite an effective and a good drug for managing pain. So what about CBD? So I think you've learned a little bit about the pharmacology of CBD already, and that CBD doesn't activate the CB1 and the CB2 receptor. And I've mentioned that the CB1 receptor activation is really one of the main reasons by which THC brings about pain relieving effects. So how does CBD work? So CBD's main mechanism of action in pain is actually through activation of the serotonin receptor, the 5-HT1A receptor. This is the main way that it brings about analgesia, but also that it relieves anxiety and has other kind of CNS effects. It also activates these ion channels, these TRP channels that are involved in the transmission of pain. So that is a similar mechanism of action to THC. And it also affects glycine receptors' ability to perceive pain. There doesn't seem to be a role for CB1 or CB2 activation by CBD because it doesn't normally activate these receptors, but there is some suggestion that CBD can increase the level of endocannabinoids by inhibiting their breakdown or their transport. And so this can cause an indirect cannabinoid activation just by increasing the amount of endocannabinoids that are in our brain or in our nerve terminals. So there may be a small role for CB1 and CB2 activation also by CBD, but it's not the main mechanism of action. And there is also some data to say that CBD can enhance the action of opioids. So it's not through the same mechanism as THC through the CB1 receptor, but there does seem to be some modulation of morphine by CBD also. So again, the take-home message is that there are multiple ways by which CBD can bring about analgesia. Some of those are similar to how THC acts, but some of them are different. And when you add THC and CBD together, you can get better analgesia than either compound alone. So animal studies have proven that. So CBD and THC are the compounds that we know best about, and they're the ones that have been best studied both scientifically in terms of understanding their mechanism of action, but also in terms of clinical trial data. But actually other phytocannabinoids have analgesic properties. And this data that I'm going to share with you is all preclinical, so it's still all at the animal stage. But what it tells you is that the future looks bright in terms of more research being done on whether or not some of these novel phytocannabinoids could be interesting analgesic agents, and whether they might work better than THC or CBD, or whether they might work synergistically with THC or CBD. But there's still a lot of work to be done. So cannabinol, CBN, has been shown in a few studies to reduce pain, and this is one example where it's been shown to reduce facial pain and also to enhance the analgesic effect of CBD. So when you put CBN and CBD together, they worked better than either compound alone. CBDA, which is the precursor for CBD, cannabidiolic acid, has also been shown to have quite good anti-inflammatory and analgesic effects in models of inflammatory pain. So it works, CBDA works quite like CBD, but it's actually more potent. And it was also found to work synergistically with THC. So if you put THC and CBDA together, you had a better analgesic effect than with either compound alone. So maybe the THC-CBD combination in Sativex has been shown to be successful, but maybe a THC-CBDA combination would be more successful than Sativex. Cannabichromene, CBC, is another compound phytocannabinoid that has been shown to be analgesic in animal models. And also the most recent data comes on this compound called THCP, which is also very effective in pain models. So I've mentioned the fact that THC and CBD can both synergize with opioids, so they can enhance the effects of opioids, and opioids can enhance the effects of cannabinoids. What is the data to support this? So we have quite a lot of preclinical animal data that shows that there is a synergic effect between the two compounds. So part of the reason for this is that cannabinoid receptors, and specifically the CB1 receptor and the opioid receptor, are co-localized at the cell membrane, and that means that the receptors are found in very close proximity to each other on the cell membrane. And so when they are both activated, there is some cross interaction between the receptors that enhances the effect of either receptor being activated individually. So we have a meta-analysis, so we have a quite high level of data of at least 19 preclinical animal studies that have shown that you need less opioid, less morphine or codeine when you have some THC present. So that has been well proven through animal studies. So what about human data? Do we have any clinical trial data to support the idea that a cannabinoid such as THC can be used as a mechanism to reduce the dose of opioid that a pain patient is on. So at the moment, the data that we have is all still observational. So this is still uncontrolled clinical trial data that suggests that cannabis-based medicines can reduce opioid use. So there are 3 studies here in reasonably high patient numbers. So in 244 patients, the use of medicinal cannabis was found to cause a 64% decrease in their opioid dosage. Another study found that people who used medicinal cannabis were 5 times more likely to reduce their daily prescription of opioids. And a larger study in 1,321 patients found that there was a 53% decrease in opioid dosing. So this is something that I think in the future is going to become quite important, and maybe something that people are going to start measuring more in their clinical trials, is not just whether or not cannabinoids are effective as pain relievers, but whether or not they're effective at being able to reduce the opioid dose that people are on whilst maintaining the same level of analgesia. And therefore there will be a lot less side effects of the opioid, and this will help to reduce the opioid crisis. So this leads on quite nicely to a little look at what the future looks like. So what are the upcoming clinical trials that are being carried out looking at the use of cannabis-based medicines in pain, and what does that tell us about what the future might look like, and how cannabis-based medicines are used? And this data comes from a really useful website called clinicaltrials.gov, and you can use clinicaltrials.gov to search for any kind of disorder with any kind of medication. All trials must be registered on a clinical trials registry, and this is the registry that most trials use. So it is a way of finding out everything that is being done if you want to do more research on this area. So this is a really active area of clinical research. So we have currently at least 46 registered active trials looking at cannabis-based medicines in the management of pain. 34 of these are in the US and 4 are in Canada. So it's the rest are in other countries across the globe. It's a very research active area. We don't think that we've done enough. We have 68 published trials already, but we think that there's more to be done. The type of pain disorders that are being investigated in these kind of ongoing trials include chronic pain, post-operative pain, low back pain, endometriosis. So you can see that we are doing more work on endometriosis and pelvic pain, traumatic injury pain. That's something we don't have enough a lot of data on already. HIV neuropathy, we do have some data on already, but they're obviously building on this, and osteoarthritis, which is an area that we don't have any clinical trial data on at the moment. There are several different pharmaceutical companies or medicinal cannabis-based companies that are doing this research. So one of the things you can do on clinicaltrials.gov is you can see who's sponsoring the trial, who's providing the product, and you can find out all details about the trial. But the companies that are currently doing research on cannabis-based medicine in pain include Pure Green, Aurora, Centura Health, Daisy Pharma, Tetra Biopharm, and Epitech. And you can look at which products are being used. So from my analysis of the trials that are registered at the moment, it seems like the compounds that are being investigated are pure THC, the THC and CBD in various ratios, sometimes 1-to-1, products other than Sativex. So people are trying to make other versions of Sativex, maybe by a tablet form or a capsule form. Dronabinol, which is THC, cannabis oil, which tends to be a whole plant extract, cannabis, and PEA. So Epitech are the company that make PEA products, and I mentioned already in this lecture that PEA has been shown to be beneficial in inflammatory pain and in endometriosis and in arthritis. So when we look at what phases this research is on, so what is the strength of evidence and we're going to get from all of this clinical trial data when these trials are finished and the evidence is out there, There are 24 phase 2 trials, so you can still see that there's a predominance of this kind of proof of concept, small patient number clinical trials being done. But we do have 9 phase 3 clinical trials, so 9 bigger trials that might actually lead to changes in prescribing practices. So let's just have a little look in detail at some of these phase 3 studies. And what is it that they're measuring? Because I mentioned that I personally think that pain ratings are probably not the best things to be looking at in cannabis-based medicines. So on clinicaltrials.gov, you can look up outcome measures. You can see what it is that people are going to be assessing as their primary endpoint. So the first study is looking at cannabidiol, so pure cannabidiol for tooth extractions. So this is for acute pain. There's not a great amount of data that cannabinoids are good in acute pain. They do tend to work better in chronic pain. And this study is using a pain scale as their primary endpoint. There's another trial looking at cannabis versus oxycodone. And again, this is going to be using a numerical pain rating. Then there's a study with dronabinol, so with THC or cannabinol, and these are both as their primary endpoint looking at morphine equivalence or opioid consumption. So you can see these trials with really quite big patient numbers, 460 patients in the dronabinol study and 220 patients in the cannabinol study. These are actually going to be measuring whether or not these compounds are effective at reducing opioid use in their patients as their primary endpoint. So if they're successful, what this could mean in the future is that compounds like these could be licensed as adjunct therapies with people who are using opioids to reduce their opioid dosing. And then we've got another study looking at cannabidiol and using a pain scale as their primary endpoint. So you can see some of these trials are quite big numbers. Obviously they're phase 3, so they're going to be big numbers. I like personally to see the change in the kind of perspective of the primary endpoints towards opioid use. It would be nice to see more trials also looking at quality of life measures rather than just pain measures. So in conclusion, we've covered quite a lot in this lecture. It's a big area. The use of cannabis-based medicines in pain is huge. The clinical trial evidence of cannabis-based medicines is huge, and it's still a huge research active area that people are working in. We have a very long history of using cannabis for pain relief. I think we know pretty well that cannabis works. I think what we don't have is necessary conclusive use of exactly which products are beneficial for exactly which pain indications. And I do think that's a level of granularity that would be good for us to be able to know in the future for more specific prescribing of the correct products. We have quite a lot of clinical trial data using different types of products in different types of pain disorders with pretty mixed results, but on the whole, they do tend to be positive and favouring the use of cannabis-based medicines for reducing pain in a variety of pain disorders. The strength of that clinical evidence depends on the product type. So for some products like Sativex, we have quite high confidence that they work, and for other products like pure CBD, our confidence is quite low because we have very limited amount of clinical trial data. I think that the clinical trial design in pain studies does need to be improved. We need to think about what it is that we really want to change in these patients. Is it pain, or is it quality of life, or is it their opioid use? So really defining that research question of what is the primary endpoint, what is the most important thing that I want to change in these patients with cannabis-based medicines could be thought about more differently. We have, so the anecdote, so this long history of people for thousands of years using cannabis to self-medicate their pain relief, we know now actually has a really strong scientific background. So we know the mechanism of action. We've got a very strong preclinical literature base for both THC and CBD, and understanding how they work in combination, how they work in combination with opioids. and a lot of upcoming research with other phytocannabinoids. So I would say watch this space. It may not be just about THC and CBD, and it may be that some of these other compounds that we're learning more about through our preclinical literature could end up being very important in clinical use.